It's good to have you back with us here today, and thanks for starting your week off with us here on the TD Ameritrade Network. I want to talk a little bit about gold pulling back some. I'd imagine this is more tied to rates coming off recent lows because for the most part, the dollar's been flat, holding right around the 96.50 level.
Yeah, for sure. You see rates coming off those lows, like you just said, and it becomes a risk-off scenario, and that's why you're seeing pressure on gold. But you can't forget some of the positive reports, some of the positive economic numbers we've started seeing recently coming out of China as well. So that really adds in, Ben, to the total macro picture here of some risk-off, of some complacency in the marketplace. And you take a look at the overall market and you take a look at the metals market, and then all you have to do is look at VIX, right? VIX is at 6-month low here. I mean, we're in the 12 handle here, and you could really see how the two work hand in hand together.
So Scott, with some of the prior concerns that we were dealing with, whether it be trade or some of the economic data, as you mentioned, some of that has been coming in a little bit better. As these subside, you'd think some of the demand concerns would as well, right? So we would hear some demand concerns subsiding in terms of energies and industrial metals. But for the most part, silver, again, having more industrial uses and exposure, in theory, you would think this is getting a bit of a lift from this. But for the most part, silver still continues to be a little bit weak. I'm wondering, I guess, why, if we're not so concerned about the health and well-being of the economic situation based on some of the data that we've been getting and the fact that it may not be as bad as we initially thought, why silver, again, an industrially used metal, why it hasn't benefited, and for that matter, copper as well, Scott?
I was actually going to bring up the copper point as well. Okay. And I think that those are a little bit of the laggards, right? The go-to in the metals market, just based on economic moves, based on how the gold market is doing, is gold. Okay. So the other two are laggards. Now, let's see what happens if and when we actually do get some resolution to the tariff issue. And I think what you're going to see is the biggest mover there is going to be, of the three that we're talking about, is actually copper there. Because I think the market maybe is getting a little bit ahead of itself with gold, in terms of some sort of resolution to the tariff here. But if we get a resolution here, I think you're going to see a nice pop in copper because, then, okay, maybe we really do have the numbers that we've seen coming out of China. Maybe this is just the start. Maybe they will really start ramping up again. And if we do, you're going to see that copper number 310, probably even higher.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that we've been talking about with some of our guests was how central bank activity has been, well, some of the buying that we had seen there had been lifting gold. But, I'm wondering, Scott, if some of the risk-on type activity that we've been seeing in terms of the indices, I mean, if this continues this week, in theory, we could see gold continue to open up the door to the downside. I mean, we're seeing a fairly nice inverse correlation there as of recent, at least into the end of last week.
No doubt about it. I think there's a 1286 or so is a technical number that people are watching. I'm actually looking not to 1250 because that would be a real drastic move to the downside here. But I think 1275 is not out of the cards here. If we continue to see some good earnings numbers coming out, you and Kevin just talked about it, the next week or two are really, really a big shot in the arm for the market here across the space with banks and Netflix and techs, and you really have some big earnings. And if you can see some decent numbers across the board here and the market starts to approach those new highs, I think you're going to see gold below 1275.
So Scott, this week we get a little bit of housing data, but I'd imagine, again, as we talk a lot about on the show, for the most part, copper's probably more focused on some of the U.S.-China trade talks and the bigger picture discussion, not so much just domestic housing data, although those numbers are important and we should keep an eye on them. Again, ultimately, it all comes down to trade still.
No question about it. The numbers are very important. I mean, especially for the copper market here, we want to see a robust housing market. That's probably just not going to happen over the next weeks, months. Yeah. But yes, the market's going to trade, and the psychological part of that trade is all going to be focused on the U.S.-China trade talks.